No man dared step into the blizzard until one broken cowboy walked into hell to save them. Hank felt the wind bite at his face as he looked out across the frozen plains. It had been years since he'd ridden these lands, and even longer since he'd felt the thrill of a good fight, the rush of the wind against his skin. The old cowboy had been broken, both inside and out. Once he had been a gunslinger, fast with a revolver and quicker with his words, but that was before the fight that ended it all, before the outlaw gang that had taken everything from him. Now Hank was just a shadow of the man he once was. His body ached from old wounds, and his heart was a battlefield of its own. He had traded his guns for a quiet life on the outskirts of Frost Point, a small town that had learned to survive in the frozen wastelands of the distant planet. The cold was a constant presence here, a silent reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond the walls of the town. The settlers in Frost Point had long lived in the shadow of the blizzards. They had learned to respect the storms, even fear them. No one was foolish enough to venture into the blizzards. The storms weren't just a snowstorm. No, they were something much worse. They were deadly. The fierce winds could freeze a man in minutes, and the snow could swallow him whole. Worse still, the creatures that came with the blizzards, half-frozen monsters, were far more dangerous than anything the town had ever faced. But even in a town as cold as Frost Point, there was still a sense of warmth among the people, a sense of community. And that was why, when the distress signal came from the mining colony deep in the storm, everyone knew what it meant. The colony had been in trouble for days, and no one had dared to go after them. Not even the bravest souls in the town had the courage to face the blizzard. Who could survive out there, they'd asked, shaking their heads. It's a death sentence. No man has ever come back from one of those storms. That was until Hank walked into the saloon one cold evening. The door swung open with a loud creak, and the sound of the wind howled from outside. The room fell silent as Hank stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He was older now, his face weathered and scarred from the years. His eyes were dark and hollow, a reflection of the battles he had fought. Not just on the outside, but inside as well. He had come back to Frost Point after years of wandering, a man lost to his own demons. His reputation as a gunslinger was long gone, replaced by the memory of the one fight he'd lost, one that had cost him everything. His leg, crippled in the fight, still gave him pain every day, a constant reminder of what he had once been. But as Hank walked into the saloon, he didn't look like a broken man. His eyes were sharp and his back was straight. The old cowboy might have been bent by life's hardships, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. The saloon's quiet buzz came back to life as Hank walked up to the bar. He wasn't greeted by cheers or friendly hellos. No, in a town like Frost Point, people only recognized one thing: survival. And Hank had been away for too long. He set a small satchel on the counter and took a seat, glancing at the bartender. "Whiskey," Hank said, his voice low and rough. The bartender hesitated but poured him a glass, sliding it across the counter. Hank took a sip, savoring the burn as the warmth spread through his chest. He hadn't felt warmth in a long time, not since the last time he had left Frost Point to face the blizzard, and failed. It was then that the door swung open again, and a man stepped inside. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and grim. The man walked straight to Hank, his eyes wide with fear. "Hank, you've got to help us," the man said, his voice shaky. "The mining colony's gone dark. They've been calling for help, but no one's been able to reach them. The storm is worse than anything we've ever seen." The bartender leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "No one's come back from the blizzards. We all know that." Hank stared at the man for a long moment. The storm outside raged like a beast hungry for destruction. The very idea of walking back into that frozen hell sent a shiver down his spine. But he could see the fear in the man's eyes, the desperation. He couldn't just sit there and watch people die. Not anymore. "I'm going," Hank said, his voice steady. The saloon went quiet. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're insane, Hank." "You can't," Hank repeated. "I owe it to them, and I owe it to myself." With that, Hank stood up, the pain in his leg flaring with every step. The old cowboy didn't need to say more. He knew the storm would try to break him, just like it had broken so many others. But Hank had something to prove. Not to anyone else, just to himself. He grabbed his satchel and walked toward the door. The wind howled again, louder this time, as if the storm was calling to him, daring him to step into its fury. Hank didn't flinch. He had lived through worse, and he wasn't afraid anymore. As Hank stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap. He squinted against the wind, looking out at the storm that stretched as far as the eye could see. The blizzard was like a living thing, a mass of ice and fury, swirling and twisting in the air. His leg hurt, but the pain was something he could manage. What he couldn't manage was the feeling of failure that had haunted him for so long. "I'm not that man anymore," Hank muttered to himself as he urged the horse forward. "But I can still make a difference." The town of Frost Point was now just a distant memory. Hank would walk into that storm, into the heart of the blizzard, and he would save whoever was left. It wasn't about glory. It wasn't about redemption. It was just about survival. And for the first time in years, Hank felt like maybe, just maybe, he could survive the storm. The storm had already begun to rage as Hank made his way out of Frost Point. His horse's hooves crunched on the frozen ground, the cold biting at his face like tiny needles. He pulled his coat tighter, the wind howling around him, but he didn't stop. He had made a promise to himself, and there was no turning back. The path to the mining colony wasn't marked. There were no roads to follow, just the wilderness and the howling blizzard that seemed to stretch on forever. Hank had ridden these plains before, but nothing like this. The storm was more powerful than anything he had ever experienced. The wind screamed, sending icy blasts against his face, and the snow covered everything in a thick, blinding sheet. His horse struggled to push through the snow, its breath coming out in visible clouds, but Hank knew they had no choice. The people at the colony needed help. Hank kept his eyes focused on the small lantern light ahead, a faint glow in the distance that was his only guide through the blizzard. He had to keep going, even though everything inside him screamed for him to turn back. His leg ached with every movement, the old injury flaring up, but he gritted his teeth and pushed on. There was no room for weakness in a storm like this. Not now. The wind grew stronger and the snow thicker until Hank could barely see the path in front of him. His horse, struggling to maintain its footing, stumbled, throwing Hank off balance. He cursed under his breath, but managed to stay on his feet. The cold had already begun to numb his fingers, and he had to force himself to move. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the strain of pushing forward in the face of a storm that seemed to be alive, trying to drag him under with each gust of wind. The minutes stretched into hours, and Hank's body grew heavier with exhaustion. His eyes were gritty with sleep, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The blizzard made everything harder, the cold, the fatigue, the pain in his leg. It all combined into a fog of numbness that threatened to pull him under. Yet still he pushed on. He remembered a time when he had been younger, when the wind would have felt like freedom, not a chain wrapping tighter around him with every step. He remembered his old friends, the men who had trusted him, who had once stood by his side through every battle. But they were all gone now, dead or scattered. And here he was, alone, riding into a storm that could very well be his end. As he pressed forward, he heard something. At first he thought it was just the wind, but there it was again. A faint sound, like a voice in the distance. Hank stopped, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. It could be an animal, or worse, someone lost in the storm. The cold had a way of playing tricks on the mind, but Hank wasn't taking any chances. He called out, his voice hoarse from the biting air. "Is anyone there?" For a moment there was only the roar of the wind in response. Then he heard it again, a soft, desperate cry carried by the wind. Hank urged his horse forward, hoping to find the source of the sound. The snow was getting deeper now, and his horse struggled to move. Hank pushed on, fighting the wind, determined to find whoever was out here. They couldn't be far. The cry came again, louder this time, and Hank finally saw a figure stumbling through the snow, barely visible in the storm. He pushed his horse toward the person, shouting to them, but the wind carried his voice away before it could reach the stranger. It was a man, and he was struggling to stay on his feet, his body barely visible in the swirling snow. He was shivering, his face pale with frost, and his movements were slow, as if the storm had already taken its toll on him. Hank didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, pulling alongside the man. "Get on," Hank ordered, reaching down to help him up. The man looked at him, confused and disoriented, but Hank didn't wait for a response. He grabbed the man by the arm and pulled him up onto the horse behind him. The stranger clung to Hank's coat for support, his teeth chattering as he struggled to stay upright. Hank didn't waste any time. He urged his horse forward, moving through the storm with a purpose. The man's weight was a burden, but Hank didn't care. They were in this together now, and he couldn't leave him behind. As they moved forward, the wind seemed to pick up again, the storm howling in fury. The cold burned against Hank's skin, the snow so thick that he could barely see the path ahead. His leg throbbed with pain, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. The stranger's presence was a reminder that there was still hope, still a reason to fight. The man clung to him tightly, his face buried in Hank's back. Hank could feel the heat of his body against his own, but it wasn't enough to fight off the cold. Still, they pressed on. The storm was relentless, but Hank's resolve was stronger. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of the mining colony. The lights of the small settlement flickered in the distance, barely visible through the blinding snow. Hank felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. The storm had claimed so much already, and he wasn't sure if he was too late. He urged his horse forward, pushing through the snow toward the glowing lights. As they drew closer, Hank could see the workers gathered near the entrance, their faces lined with fear and exhaustion. They had been waiting for help, but it had come at a price. The storm had taken more than just their homes. It had taken their hope. Hank's heart pounded as he dismounted from his horse, helping the stranger down. The people of the colony gathered around them, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. They had made it. They had survived the storm. But for how long? Hank knew the answer. The blizzard wasn't just a storm. It was something much worse, and if he couldn't stop it, the mining colony would be lost. But for now, Hank had done what he came to do. He had brought someone back, and that was enough to give him the strength to face whatever came next. Hank stood at the edge of the mining colony, looking over the small group of people gathered in the cold, their faces tired and fearful. The storm still raged around them, but the faint glow of the colony's lights offered some warmth and hope. The people here had been waiting for someone to save them, and Hank had arrived just in time, but the relief was short-lived. The storm was far from over, and Hank knew that the real challenge was yet to come. The man he had rescued earlier stumbled forward, his steps unsteady but his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice weak from the cold. "You saved me." Hank nodded, but his attention was already on the workers. They had all gathered near the central building, their faces drawn with exhaustion, fear, and the haunting uncertainty of their future. The colony had been trapped in the storm for days, and now they were all on the edge, desperate for help. "We've been calling for help for days," one of the workers spoke up, his voice rough from the cold. "But no one's come. We thought we were going to die out here." Hank glanced at the man, his heart heavy with sympathy. The storm had taken its toll on everyone, but there was still hope, at least. That was what he told himself. But as he looked at the faces around him, the doubt began to creep in. Was it enough? Could they survive the night, let alone the storm? "We can't stay here long," Hank said, his voice steady, but inside he was uncertain. The storm is still fierce.
But the shelter they needed wasn't just a building.
The storm wasn't like any they had faced before. It wasn't just snow and wind. It was something much worse. Hank had seen the signs when he was on his way here. The eerie stillness that came with the storm, the unnatural way the wind howled and the snow swirled in strange patterns. This wasn't just weather. It was a weapon. "We'll take shelter in the main building," one of the workers suggested, pointing to the large structure at the center of the colony. "It's sturdy enough to withstand the storm. But there's something else we need to tell you. We're not just worried about the cold." Hank raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The worker's eyes flickered nervously. "There's something out there. Something in the storm. We've been hearing strange noises, like voices, soft, low voices coming from the blizzard. At first we thought it was just the wind."
But after a while, we realized it wasn't. The others nodded in agreement, their faces drawn with fear.
Hank frowned. He had heard stories about creatures that lurked in the blizzards, half-human, half-animal monsters that could survive in the freezing cold. He didn't believe in legends, but something about this storm felt different. He could sense it in the air, a presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "We're not safe here," Hank said, his voice grim. "This storm is hiding something. Something that wants us to freeze." The group fell silent, the weight of Hank's words settling over them. The wind howled louder, and the snow seemed to swirl in strange patterns, as if something were moving just out of sight. Hank could feel it. There was something in the storm, something waiting. And whatever it wasn't friendly. "We need to move," Hank urged, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Stay close, and whatever you do, don't wander off." With that, Hank led the group toward the main building. The wind grew fiercer as they moved, the snow biting into their faces like sharp needles. Hank's leg throbbed with each step, but he kept moving, focusing on the task at hand. The people behind him were depending on him to lead them to safety, and he couldn't afford to slow down. They reached the building just as the wind reached its peak, howling like a wild animal. Hank pushed open the heavy doors, and the group stumbled inside, gasping for warmth. The building was cold, but it offered a small reprieve from the storm outside. Once inside, Hank checked the doors, ensuring they were secure. The windows were all covered with thick metal shutters, and the colony's lights flickered weakly, struggling against the storm. Hank's mind raced as he considered their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. They needed to figure out how to stop the storm, or at least survive it. The group huddled in the corner, their faces pale and weary. Hank stood near the door, his eyes constantly scanning the outside. He could still feel that presence, that strange, unnatural feeling in the air. The storm was more than just a blizzard. It was a force of nature, something that couldn't be understood or predicted. "What are we going to do now?" one of the workers asked, his voice shaky with fear. Hank turned to face him, his face set in a determined expression. "We survive. We wait for the storm to pass, and in the meantime, we make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." The wind howled outside, the sound like a chorus of screams. Hank's eyes narrowed. The storm wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a weapon, and whoever had unleashed it had something in mind. He couldn't let it consume the people in this colony, not if he could stop it. Hank paced the room, his thoughts swirling. He needed to find the source of the storm. He needed to understand what was causing it. It was too precise, too deliberate. It wasn't just bad weather. Someone was controlling it. Someone was using it to hunt. "Listen up," Hank said, his voice steady. "We don't have much time. We need to figure out what's causing this storm. It's not just snow and ice, it's something else. We'll need to find shelter in here for now, but we can't hide forever. We have to face whatever's out there before it's too late." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but Hank's resolve was clear. He had faced worse in his life, had seen horrors that no man should ever see, and yet this was different. This was something beyond his understanding, something that had come for them, and he had no choice but to fight back. The storm howled once more, shaking the walls of the building. But Hank stood tall, his mind set on the task at hand. They couldn't let the storm win. Not this time. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown worse. The howling winds outside seemed to be tearing at the building's walls, and the snow piled higher with each passing hour. Hank paced the floor of the main building, his mind racing, trying to figure out their next move. The workers were huddled together in the corner, too tired and too frightened to speak. Their eyes constantly glanced toward the windows, as if expecting the storm to breach the walls at any moment. But Hank wasn't looking outside anymore. His focus was inward. The presence he had felt earlier, the eerie feeling that something was out there, waiting, was growing stronger. It wasn't just a storm. It was a force of nature, a weapon, and it was hunting them. He had seen signs of it in the swirling snow, the unnatural quiet before the wind screamed. Whatever it wasn't just the storm. It was something else. Something far more dangerous. The people inside the building had already lost hope. They had been trapped for too long, and the storm seemed endless. Hank could feel their fear, could hear the desperation in their voices whenever they spoke. He couldn't let that fear control him. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it now. His legs still throbbed from the long ride through the snow, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. But Hank pushed it aside. The cold had already taken enough from them. The storm had already stolen so many things from these people. He wouldn't let it take their lives, too. A loud thump against the door snapped Hank out of his thoughts. He jerked his head toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver at his side. The others in the room stiffened, their eyes wide with fear. Was it the storm? Or was it something else? Hank motioned for them to stay quiet as he slowly moved toward the door. The thumping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if something or someone was trying to break in. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. He turned back to the group, his face grim. "Stay back. Whatever's out there, we're not ready for it. But we can't hide forever. We've got one chance to survive this, and it's time to face it." The workers looked at each other, but none of them spoke. They were scared. They didn't know what to do, and Hank didn't blame them. They were just trying to survive, just like he was. But the time for hiding was over. Hank moved to the window, looking out into the blizzard. The snow had turned a strange shade of green, as if something unnatural was influencing the storm. The winds howled, but there was no sign of the creatures he had feared. The silence in the air was more unsettling than the wind itself. It was as if the storm had paused, waiting. Hank didn't have time to waste.
He grabbed a heavy coat from one of the workers and threw it over his shoulders. "We're going outside," he said, his voice strong.
"We'll take the fight to whatever's out there." A murmur of protest rose from the group, but Hank ignored it. They had to face this storm together, or they wouldn't make it through. The longer they waited, the more likely they were to be caught in the storm's grip, and whatever was causing this blizzard was still out there, waiting for them to make the first mistake. Hank opened the door, the bitter cold cutting through the crack. He stepped outside, squinting against the swirling snow. His breath came out in puffs, visible in the air like smoke. He scanned the area, but the storm seemed to have swallowed everything in its path. The snow was so thick it was like walking through a wall. The wind roared in his ears, and Hank had to shout to be heard. "Follow me," he called over his shoulder. "We're heading for the ridge. If we're going to survive, we need to stop whatever's controlling this storm." The workers hesitated, but Hank didn't wait. He moved forward, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but his determination was stronger than the storm itself. They had to find the source of the blizzard, whatever it was, and put an end to it. As they trudged through the deep snow, Hank felt the presence again. It was closer now, watching them from the storm, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. The storm was alive, and it was hunting them. Hank's mind raced. Was it an alien force? Some kind of weapon? He had no answers, only the gnawing certainty that whatever it wasn't natural. The wind seemed to bend around them, pushing them forward as if the storm itself was guiding them to the ridge. Then, from the depths of the snow, a shape appeared, moving fast and low to the ground. It was hard to make out at first, the figure hidden by the thick snowfall. But Hank's instincts kicked in, and he pulled the revolver from his side, pointing it into the wind. The creature emerged fully from the storm, revealing a twisted, monstrous shape. It was humanoid in form, but its skin was pale and stretched, like frozen flesh pulled too tight. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its mouth opened in a silent scream as it lunged toward them. The workers screamed in panic, but Hank stood his ground. He fired his revolver, the shots ringing out in the frozen air. The creature shrieked and stumbled back, but it didn't fall. It was stronger than anything Hank had ever faced. But he didn't hesitate. He fired again, and this time the creature dropped to the snow, its body crumpling under the weight of the shot. The others stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror, but Hank didn't give them time to think. "Keep moving," he shouted. "The ridge is just ahead. We need to get there before more of them show up." They kept moving, fear pushing them forward. Hank's heart raced as the storm roared around them, but he didn't stop. He could feel the weight of the others behind him, their lives depending on him. There was no turning back now. They reached the ridge, and for a moment the storm seemed to quiet. The wind died down, the snow stopped falling, and the air felt still. It was as if the storm itself was watching them, waiting for something. Hank looked out over the ridge, scanning the horizon. He couldn't see the source of the storm, but he knew it was out there. Whatever it was, it had to be stopped, and Hank wasn't going to let it win. Not now. "We make our stand here," Hank said, his voice steady. "We fight for our lives, for this town, and for the people we've lost. The storm ends now.